ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome ONUG co-founder and Gluware Chief Product Officer, Ernest Leffner. Joining us then online will be Jeremy Schulman, our Senior Director of Solution Engineering with Major League Baseball. Welcome, everyone.
Well, thanks, everybody. Again, I'm Ernest Leffner, the Chief Product Officer with Gluware. Also, I'm the co-founder of this great conference with Nick Lippis, and I'm joined by Jeremy. Jeremy, would you take a minute to just share about yourself and what you do at Major League Baseball?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on the program. Pleasure to be here. My name is Jeremy Schulman. I've been with Major League Baseball for about 4 years. It's the first time I've been on the customer side of the equation. I've been in networking the industry for over 25 years. And my team is responsible for the strategic direction and tactical implementation of all things network automation.
Sounds like an easy job.
It is a fabulous job.
All right. We know that Major League Baseball is actively automating their IT network to achieve some specific business objectives. You know, you guys are working internally and complemented by Gluware with the pre-built intelligent network automation to accelerate hyper automation. I get paid a nickel every time I say that phrase. Would you mind just talking a little bit about your IT network, about what's different, what's important about it, and what makes network automation so important for you?
Sure, yeah. We have a really interesting network here. I like to describe it as a very complex surface area of a problem where we have to address all aspects of every type of domain technology and networking. So it isn't just data center, it isn't just the WAN, it isn't just campus and LAN, it's all of those things. And we do this not only at our offices, and our data centers that we have, but also all of the ballparks. So if you could imagine, every ballpark is a mini data center. It is a campus and LAN environment where we operate Wi-Fi. We have VoIP phones in the dugouts and iPads in the dugouts for the players. We have high-speed tracking cameras. We have all sorts of very complex and interesting audio video technology that requires complex routing protocols, multicast, precision time protocol, all sorts of very interesting problems. So when we try to address the automation problem as a whole, we have to consider all of these aspects and then do it in a multi-vendor environment. So it's very challenging. We have a very focused network engineering and operations team. So we're not a team of 100 people to take on this challenge. And automation is extraordinarily important to our rhythm of business.
So I'm going to go just a tiny bit, but safely off script. You talked, when we were prepping for this, you talked a little bit about, the windows you have to operate, some of the complexities there. Would you mind just share a little bit, like what happens if the network goes wrong? Like what's that impact? I know some of us might guess a little bit of what that might look like, but I think I come from banking, you're coming from sports entertainment. There's no tolerance for those kinds of outages. Could you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, in the rhythm of our business, say at the ballparks themselves, we have a very high degree of redundancy. So we have multiple service providers providing all of our circuits. Our network design is highly redundant. The systems that operate there, like the video systems and the audio systems, they're all very highly redundant. So even if we were to, lose one of our circuits, for example, which does not really happen during a game, knock on wood, we have, many failover scenarios, and we test all of that very complex routing using automation tooling. And we try to the best of our efforts to ensure that if there is going to be any kind of hiccups in the operations, that is nothing the fans would ever see. These are things that we would address behind the scenes in real time by our operations team.
I appreciate that. I know now I can really tell my father, he's a big baseball fan, and every time the internet goes out and he can't watch the game, somehow that's my fault. And I'm responsible for all of the issues in the internet. So I appreciate that. What made you realize that network automation was something that you needed, and what are your automation objectives?
Yeah, so I was brought in at a time when there was no automation at MLB, really, but there was an extraordinary push towards cloud automation and system automation, and application automation, and so the leadership wanted the same automation capabilities that we were experiencing from the cloud and other DevOps types of workflow patterns they wanted in the network. You hear the same kind of tropes where the network is the bottleneck. Why does it take so long with the network? How can we improve the network? At a very high level, those tropes are true, and these are real problems that need to be solved. The way I look at it is there are really two basic problems that always need to be addressed, which is in the off season, we deal with the how do we deploy our projects, because that's when we do our real project work, and that's the aha to cha-ching kind of equation where it's like, aha, we got to turn up 19 ballparks for the minor leagues. How quickly can we do that with a high degree of quality and reliability when we're trying to deal with all sorts of nuances in that environment that involve contractors and supply chain issues, all that. So we have the aha to ching problem. And then we have the, oh crap to all clear problem where we're in season and we need to have proactive visibility to the operations of our network so that we can address problems before they're seen, or quickly, understand root cause and remediate them as they need to be.
That's those are like two dichotomies, right? One where you're in full build mode and the other one where you're in full monitor mode. And from the financial services side of the house, right? Every time the trading window was open, that anxiety would build, right? And you needed to have confidence in that infrastructure. So let's move on. How are you using Gluware today, and how's it going?
Yeah, so the way we look at automation as a whole, and this is something I wanted to kind of take a step back and kind of set the context, is I think about it in three kind of constructs. There's buy, there's borrow, and there's build. Right. And when you're an enterprise company with a constrained set of resources, people, I look at the problem as how much product, commercial available product can we use that, fills a need, solves a real problem so that I'm not building technology that exists just for fun. Right. So, when we have a problem, and we'll talk about the problem that we immediately gravitated with Gluware, we wanted to buy that product because it solved the need, and we can exchange money for a system that we can trust and rely on, and a company that we can trust and rely on to help us, like Gluware. Then there's the borrow aspect, and you hear about open source products or projects and things that you want to use. They don't cost money, but they're free like a free puppy, right? They take time and energy to manage, but they're quote, there's no budget assigned to them from a CapEx. It's just operational expense at that point. And then there's build, and there's going to be certain automations or solutions that we need to have in-house that are going to be very specific to our line of business because we're a very unique business. And that's where we want to put all of our automation development time. So we look at it in kind of that context. And then even within that context, we look at the network engineers and the network operations team as not only are they going to operate network automation technologies, like they operate Gluware and products, but some of them want to develop their own skill sets so that they can build their own tools for their own use to help them do their own jobs. That's not tools that they would put, quote, in production to operationalize the network, but everybody is looking for the how can you do more with less. And a lot of times it's how can we take processes that are repetitive and allow the network engineers to build their own tools that they are intimately familiar with the workflow patterns that they need. So there's that aspect as well. So that's kind of the context of, why we chose to buy a product like Gluware is because the problem that we had to solve was we have a multi-vendor network, multiple vendors, multiple operating systems in some of those vendors. And we need to ensure that our network is running the proper version of code across all these different vendors. So it's the OS upgrade. How do we ensure that all of our software is in compliance and up to date? And it sounds like a problem that that you want to automate. It's drudgery work if you think about it. There's not like a value add. It's like you're not adding services to the network. But it's something you absolutely have to do, whether it's for new features that you need in the network or it's bug fixing, patching your operating system because there are bugs. This is a task that, takes away time from, shall I say, meaningful work. And if you can buy a product that is point and click and I can upgrade my network with confidence, that's a product that we're attracted to. And that's the core reason why we wanted to go with a product like Gluware.
I really appreciate the way you put that. And, I don't know if folks know this, but I came from the customer side 25 years. So I'm just brand new to the vendor side, 18 months. And I've tried a variety of different ways to kind of solve these problems. And I kind of came to the same conclusion you did, which was, it's not a this or that, right? That you buy what you need. And I really liked the comment you made, which was what differentiates you as a business is where the development is worth the effort. That's where the business value starts to really surface itself. When I talk to customers all the time, I tell them, if you want to do a set port enable, there is no value to that, right? The CIO doesn't care that you configured a switch in the data center, right? But they will care if the applications were validated afterwards and you made sure the business services were functioning. I think, you're really just sort of driving that message home. Any other thoughts you want to add about that value?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is I'll talk to network engineers and they always ask, how do I get started? Where should I start my journey? Mr. Jeremy here has been on this modern network automation journey for over 10 years now, right? So I started probably in 2011, 2012, really on the tip of the spear, trying out new ideas. I was the first one, for example, to use Ansible for networking. And that kind of grew legs and everybody tried to use Ansible for everything. And there's some really great things that you can do with Ansible. For example, it's a very common tool. You hear it a lot in conversation. And somebody asked me, hey, I really want to automate doing OS upgrades. And I'm thinking about doing it in Ansible. And I just kind of shook my head because it sounds like a good idea in theory, but in practice, it's a complicated mess. It's like that Cards Against Humanity meme. It's like, sounds good in practice, but kind of a mess in reality because there's so many edge considerations one has to deal with about, is the network in a state where it should be upgraded? Is this backed up? Is the running config saved? Like all these little nuances are something that somebody who's never programmed, as a profession might not consider. And when you think about doing a software upgrade and the opportunities for what failure means, you could literally brick a box in some cases. You don't want to necessarily work on that problem first. So that was not a good example. When I had this discussion with the individual, it's like, that's not where I would start my automation journey. Even though it's a really big problem, it's interesting you identify that as it's a real big problem. We want to solve it from a business perspective so we can go on and work on meaningful work. But, trying to do software upgrades, writing that code, I've done that 3 times at 3 companies. And when I came to an actual end customer, I'm like, I don't want to write that code again.
I can't blame you. That rabbit hole goes deep and it will last forever. So I definitely can appreciate that. As you were going through the selection process, what was it about Gluware that sort of nudged your choice, the Gluware way?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it's multi-vendor out of the box, right? So we can, with a point and click experience, meaning with very little training, we had the environment set up and fully operational so that our operations team could use it. And they could schedule and coordinate the upgrades, ballpark by ballpark or function by function. And it gave them a very good user experience to do that scheduling and then observe as it was running the tasks it was performing so they could gain trust in the system and then ensure that things were upgraded properly. Gluware also offers a really nice API for folks like my team that even want to go to the next step and interrogate the system via the API to see how are things going or what is on track for today or who is doing a thing. And we can use the API to, add automation even on top of the operator experience.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. On top of coming to ONUG, the keynote, of course, it's sponsored by Gluware. We want you to know all about Gluware, but we don't want to take the opportunity to bring someone like Jeremy around and not accomplish 2 things. First, give him an opportunity to share a little bit of his wisdom and best practices, as well as give folks here an opportunity to ask a question. So if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we'll find someone to bring you a mic. But while that's happening, Do you have any best practices or things you'd like to talk about, things to watch out for, et cetera? Maybe some advice about, automation you'd like to share with the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to do two things. The first is if you're going to talk with your leadership about doing automation, right? There is the it needs to get done versus, sure, it would be nice if it got done. Sussing out what actually drives business value is super important. And I wish there was a one size fits all answer here. There generally isn't, although, doing OS upgrades is a pretty simple example of, everybody has to do that. But when you look at automation development projects, meaning, you're going to either buy consultant time with a vendor to customize their system, or you're going to build a series of Ansible playbooks, or you're going to write bespoke Python, whatever that might be. Understanding the metrics to account for how you value that. Meaning, if there's something that you're going to do 100 times a week, like say, for example, in our case, at the ballparks, we have VoIP phones, and sometimes we need to bounce the phones, to reboot them, get their IP addresses set up, whatnot. That's something that happens all the time. People move phones around. That's a really good thing to identify early on in the process, because if you don't understand what's valuable to the stakeholders of the network, not necessarily what's in value to the network engineers, most of the technology that we build, we're not building it to make the network engineers' jobs better. They get a better work balance by the fact that we've got tools that are self-service, so that the stakeholders of the network, for example, our ballpark engineers, they can do these things on a self-service basis. So it's really important to suss that out. And by doing that, you need to take measurements. Like, if you've got an operations team, do they measure or keep track of what they do on a day-to-day basis, so that somebody can come in and do an analysis and say, you spend 40% of your time, doing these 5 or 10 tasks. These are candidates for automation. It's probably something you've heard in the past, but it is very important to do your homework up front and get the buy-in from leadership, so that resources are available, whether that means funding for headcount or funding for contractors, or even allocation of what I would call safe harbor time. So, if you're a network engineer, and you want to develop these skills, you need a quantitative amount of time, like 6 hours a day, just heads down focused. Doing programming work is very concentration heavy, and it does not align with, interrupt driven, support this fire drill kind of exercise. So that, it doesn't sound like, automation best practice, but it's a business best practice when you're looking at committing to an automation program.
Yeah. And, we've always had this debate, right? Will network engineers become coders, right? Will they become software developers? And I think the answer in reality is kind of come in between, right? Yeah, you're going to have to dabble a little bit, right, and up the skill sets, but maybe not become a full-fledged developer, especially if you're leveraging out-of-the-box solutions. And I think one thing you said there is super salient. Managers cannot expect their people to change and evolve their skill set if they don't give them time to do it. And you've got to find a way to understand the business value of uplifting your employee and your talent. And I think you calling that out is really important. So thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, there's an analogy that I'll make here from being a vendor. When I was at a vendor and we was like, hey, we're going to sell the service provider box, and maybe you don't understand MPLS the best. Come to our class, take a 5-day course on MPLS, designing and deploying, MPLS networks, for example. And, a network manager would send their staff to that class. They would take that class. They'd put them through labs. They'd go through exercises at the end of the 5 days. They get a certificate. They're like, this is great. And they feel pretty good about doing that job the very next day, right? And that's what network engineering managers are used to. They're accustomed to send engineer to training. They get trained. They turn around. They have some immediate value add to the business. This is not true